They laughed. My daughter laughed when I fell at her wedding, and in that instant, I felt every year of my age crush me to the ground harder than the polished floor ever could. I can still hear the sound of her voice, high, bright, careless, carrying across the hall like a cruel bell, as though my stumble were some planned performance, some comic relief at her perfect day. I had been walking carefully, my heels not too high, the blue dress I'd chosen pressed and neat, my hair arranged with small silver clips, trying my best to look like the kind of mother who belonged at a wedding that had cost more than the house where she'd grown up. I remember thinking I should sit down, that my knees were tightening the way they do when weather changes. But before I could make that choice, before I could steady myself, my foot slipped on something left behind from the dinner service. Maybe a drop of wine, maybe grease. And I was suddenly down, awkwardly twisted, the sound of my body colliding with the floor, swallowed for a moment by the music, before the silence bloomed and all eyes turned toward me. And then, my daughter's laugh, quick, almost relieved, as though I had provided her with the kind of distraction she craved, as though I were not her mother at all, not the woman who carried her through fevers and exams, who stayed up sewing dresses and working overtime to pay for those very orthodontics that now gleamed as she smiled at my expense. Her words followed, sharp and dismissive. "Oh, she's fine, drama queen." She didn't come to me. She didn't extend a hand. She didn't stop the photographer or pause the music or even look directly at me as I struggled to gather myself. It was as if my fall was not an accident, but an embarrassment. Something to cover quickly with humor, something to laugh off so that her gown would remain unstained by the image of me. I am 81 now. I live alone in a coastal town where the ocean's rhythm has replaced the sound of my daughter's voice in my ears, where gulls and waves are better company than the family I once believed would carry my memory forward. My house is modest, painted white with peeling trim, and inside it, there is only me, my books, a kettle, and the photographs I salvaged before they were claimed or discarded by others. But at that wedding, in that moment, I was still trying to be part of their story. I was still imagining myself as central to the family tableau, still foolishly believing that my presence mattered, that the word mother had weight even after I had been steadily pushed to the edges of their gatherings, spoken to only when convenient, thanked only when money or childcare had passed from my hands to theirs. What hurts me most when I look back is not the fall itself, not even the sharp pain in my knee that lingered for weeks, nor the bruise that spread purple across my hip. What haunts me is the way she laughed, as if my frailty were a punchline, as if the years of sacrifice were material for a joke told to her new family. A group of strangers in fine suits and shimmering dresses who had never known me as anything but a name on an invitation. I remember clutching the edge of the banquet table, trying to lift myself, the silence of certain relatives, the forced cough of an usher pretending not to notice, and then the one distant cousin, a man I barely knew, who leaned down and offered his arm. My daughter, the bride, had already turned away, her veil glinting as she whispered to her maid of honor, her laughter still bubbling like champagne in her throat. And perhaps that was the moment, though I didn't know it yet, when I stopped being a mother and became instead a tolerated guest, the kind who is invited because not inviting her would raise questions, the kind who is kept at the table but never asked to dance, the kind who is photographed on the edge of group pictures, always smiling, always trying, always invisible in the very center of her own bloodline. I suppose I should have known long before then. There had been signs, subtle and not so subtle, moments of dismissal that I folded away like unpaid bills, telling myself that it was just stress, that she didn't mean it, that one day she would remember the nights I carried her fevered body to the hospital, the mornings I braided her hair before school, the afternoons I clapped until my hands stung at her recitals. But at the wedding, under the weight of chandeliers and the soft click of the photographer's camera, all of that dissolved. I was just a spectacle. The cruelest part was the aftermath. They did not ask if I needed to see a doctor, though I limped visibly. They did not sit me near the front, though I was the mother of the bride. They placed me at a table near the back, half filled with acquaintances, people who smiled politely, but kept checking their watches, waiting for dessert or the music to swell again. My daughter's speech that evening thanked her father, her stepmother, the groom's family, even her co-workers who had flown in from out of state. My name was not spoken, not once. When she raised her glass, I raised mine too, the cheap fizz of champagne prickling against my tongue like tiny needles, and I swallowed it down with the bitter taste of absence. Later, when the evening ended and the guests poured out under the string lights, I was handed a small envelope with cab fare and a quick kiss on the cheek. "Try not to make a scene this time," she whispered, as though my very existence threatened to unravel her perfect fabric. I clutched the money, nodded, and let myself be carried away into the night, the driver silent as I stared at the passing streets, the dress tight around my chest, the bruise blooming under the fabric where no one could see. I did not cry then. I did not curse or shout. I simply sat with it, the kind of silence only age can produce, a silence that holds more history than sound ever could. I live with that silence now, here by the sea. I rise with the tide, brew my tea, and watch the horizon, where the sky bends down to kiss the water, a place where no one is laughing at me. And yet, even in this quiet, the sound of her laughter finds me, sudden and cruel, reminding me that once, on the day that was meant to be a union of families, I was not embraced but ridiculed, not honored but dismissed, not a mother but a joke. And that is how my story begins, not with celebration, but with the sound of betrayal disguised as amusement, the kind of laughter that fractures something in you that never quite heals the same way again. It was the airport clerk who confirmed what I had already begun to suspect in the hollow of my stomach, that heavy, nauseous certainty that creeps in long before words are spoken aloud. And yet when she finally said it, when her lips formed the syllables of my daughter's married name, and she hesitated before delivering the truth, I felt as though the floor fell again beneath me, just as it had at the wedding, except this time there was no music, no glitter, no champagne laughter to soften the blow, only the flat tone of fact and the small, merciful kindness in the clerk's eyes. They had boarded without me. They had checked in their bags, shown their documents, walked down that jet bridge, and taken their seats in a row they had carefully chosen. And they had done all of it knowing I was not with them. They had not called my name across the crowd, had not asked the staff to page me, had not paused at the gate with a frantic look around. They had left me deliberately, as one might set down an unwanted parcel, and keep walking. I remember nodding, as if the information were an everyday piece of news, something like the weather forecast or the price of milk. Nodding slowly because to react too quickly would have been to admit to the clerk and to myself that this was not a misunderstanding, but a betrayal, and that if I gave in to the cry swelling in my throat, I would collapse again. But this time in front of strangers who owed me nothing. So instead, I asked her to repeat it, my voice flat but steady, and she did, softer the second time, as though cushioning the blow with tone might change the shape of the fact. I thanked her, absurdly, as if I had received good service, and I walked to the restroom not because I needed to use it, but because I needed a door to close between myself and the world, a place where I could sit without the risk of someone's pitying glance undoing me completely. Inside the stall, I lowered myself onto the seat, careful of my hip, and stared at the metal door until its dull scratches began to blur into strange shapes, initials carved by bored travelers, declarations of love or anger or boredom, left behind by people who had passed through this space and gone on to somewhere else. People who were not me, who were not sitting with the weight of abandonment pressing into their chest. I did not cry. That surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have, because there comes a point when tears are a luxury, and age teaches you to conserve them for something that still has a chance of being mended. This, I knew, was beyond mending. My daughter's laughter at the wedding had been a crack, but this deliberate act of leaving me behind, was the shattering. When I emerged from the restroom, hours had passed. Though I could not have said how many, the light through the tall windows had shifted. The tide of travelers had thinned, and announcements echoed overhead for flights I had no connection to. Voices calling out destinations that all seemed to promise something I could no longer reach. I walked slowly to the departure screen, more out of instinct than intention, scanning the list of cities with the strange detachment of someone looking at options in a diner menu, knowing they will choose something but unsure why. My daughter was already airborne, heading toward tropical beaches and smiling photographs, toward a honeymoon where my name would not be spoken. And I stood there in my sensible shoes and bruised dignity, wondering what was left for me. I cannot tell you exactly what moved me to approach the counter and say the words, "One ticket to Portland, please." Perhaps it was memory, because once long ago, as a young woman newly married, I had lived there for a brief, fragile year, riding bicycles through wet streets and believing the world was still wide open. Perhaps it was defiance, choosing the place furthest from Hawaii, a deliberate rejection of their chosen paradise. Or perhaps it was simply that I needed to be somewhere that was not here, not this airport where the air smelled of betrayal and recycled coffee. Whatever the reason, I spoke it firmly, and when the young attendant asked round trip or one way, I surprised myself by saying one way, my voice steady, my heart curiously calm. I used the card they did not know I still had. The account my daughter had assumed was long closed, and I felt a small flicker of something like victory as the transaction processed. I had enough for the ticket, enough for a motel, perhaps enough for a week or two of anonymity. It was not much, but it was mine, and after decades of being told what I needed, where I should be, how best to contribute, that small sliver of autonomy felt like oxygen filling a starved lung. The boarding process was quiet. No one looked at me. No one asked why I traveled alone. No one noticed when I removed the bright pink vacation Nana shirt my daughter-in-law had insisted I wear and stuffed it into a trash bin, leaving me in the plain blouse I had chosen myself. I stepped onto the plane with only my carry-on, the same brown leather bag my late husband had given me for our anniversary decades earlier, and as the city lights fell away beneath the wing, I did not think of Hawaii, or of photographs that would be taken without me, or of how my daughter would explain my absence to strangers. I thought only of the quiet ahead, the uncertain but undeniable fact that I was moving toward something that was mine alone. Landing in Portland late that night, the airport smaller and quieter than I remembered, I felt an odd clarity. I was not a woman left behind. I was a woman who had left. They thought they had cast me aside, but in truth, they had freed me, even if by cruelty, even if by accident. I stepped outside into air damp with recent rain, smelling of concrete and pine, and for the first time in years, I breathed without waiting for permission. That, then, was the catalyst. Not the fall at the wedding, not even the laughter that followed, but the moment at the airport when the truth was confirmed in the gentle voice of a stranger, when the page turned and I realized there would be no going back to the old role, the old place at the table, the old fiction that I belonged. It was the end of being tolerated, the end of waiting to be invited back. It was the beginning of something rawer, lonelier, and yet, perhaps, more honest. The first days after I arrived in Portland felt like wandering through a dream I could neither control nor predict. One of those dreams where you know you are walking through the architecture of your own past, yet every street corner seems altered, every familiar place carrying the echo of something long gone. I left the airport with no one waiting, no sign held with my name, no embrace or impatient glance at a watch, only the ordinary shuffle of strangers who passed by without noticing me. And strangely, that anonymity was a relief rather than an injury. I took a taxi to a modest motel I had looked up on my phone before boarding, more out of habit than plan, because I have always been the sort of woman who makes lists, who carries an address in her pocket just in case, who pretends to prepare even when she knows that preparation is an illusion. The room smelled of cleaning fluid and tired stories. One bed, one chair, a television bolted to the wall, and I lay down fully clothed and slept without dreams, the sound of the radiator ticking a steady rhythm that calmed me more than any voice could have. The next morning, I stood at the window sipping bitter coffee from the small plastic machine, watching a woman in a robe walk her dog across the damp street, and I realized with a kind of quiet astonishment that I had nowhere to be. For decades, my hours had been claimed by my children, my late husband, my job, my neighbors, by appointments and favors and obligations that multiplied like weeds. Yet in that moment, I had no schedule, no list, no reason to hurry. At first, the realization was terrifying, like stepping off a boat into open water with no rope to pull you back. But as I stood there longer, I felt something loosen in my chest, as though I were finally inhaling a breath that belonged to me. I ventured out into the city slowly, my hip protesting, but not stopping me, wandering streets that seemed both foreign and familiar. A place where I had once lived as a young woman, but which had since grown and hardened, its corners sharper, its colors more muted. I stopped at a bakery for a scone, the girl behind the counter smiling when I handed her exact change. And when she asked if I was new in town, I said, without hesitation, I used to be from here, though in truth I was not sure I belonged anywhere. Near the door there was a corkboard filled with scraps of paper, advertisements for odd jobs and items for sale, and one small note caught my eye. Room for rent. Quiet lady preferred. Cash only. No drama. The words seemed almost written for me, as if the city itself had left me a message. I copied down the number, my hands steady, and for the first time in years I felt the faint thread of possibility tugging at me. That afternoon I called, my voice trembling only slightly, and the woman on the other end, Joyce, was brisk and skeptical. but not unkind. She asked my age, whether I was clean, whether I had boyfriends, and when I chuckled and said not in a very long time, she told me to come by at 4. I walked to the address she gave, a peeling blue house with a porch that creaked beneath my feet and a wind chime that clattered like spoons. Joyce opened the door with a cigarette in hand, her cat curling around her ankles, and she looked at me with sharp eyes before stepping aside and saying, "Come in then. Let's see if we can tolerate each other." The room she showed me was small, just a bed, a dresser, a desk. But sunlight poured through the window in a way that felt like welcome. And when she asked if I wanted to stay, I said yes, handing her the cash from the envelope I had hidden in my coat. That evening, she made grilled cheese and soup, and we ate at her kitchen table in silence until she said she hated eating alone, and I nodded because I knew that particular hunger too well. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm both strange and soothing. I unpacked my few belongings as if they mattered, folding each piece of clothing carefully into the dresser, placing my toothbrush on the sink, sliding my paperback novel onto the desk. I walked the neighborhood with slow but deliberate steps, memorizing the cracked sidewalks, the hedges that smelled faintly of rain, the corner cafe with a sign reading, "Help Wanted." One morning, I paused outside that cafe, staring at the chalkboard letters until my feet carried me inside, and I asked the young woman at the counter if they were hiring. She looked surprised, as if women of my age were not supposed to ask such questions, but she called her manager from the back, a stocky woman named Heather, who sized me up with a glance before asking if I had experience. I told her I had raised 3 children and run a household for 50 years, that I knew how to make coffee and carry plates and not call in sick. She stared at me, then shrugged and said, "Trial shift tomorrow." That night, I ironed my blouse with the small motel iron, smoothing the fabric as though I were preparing for something grander than a minimum wage job, and I lay awake in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing not with fear, but with a nervous anticipation I had not felt since girlhood. In the morning, I arrived 15 minutes early, my hair tied back, my hands steady, and when the first wave of customers came in, contractors and nurses and early risers, I moved slowly but surely, pouring coffee, remembering orders, smiling when it felt natural. By the end of the shift, my feet ached, but my heart was lighter. And when Heather handed me a clean towel instead of criticism, I knew I had passed some invisible test. My first paycheck was small, only $74, but when I cashed it and felt the bills in my hand, I realized I had not held money that belonged solely to me in years. For so long, everything I had earned or saved or spent was entangled with others, with my children's needs, with bills and birthdays and obligations that never left me enough for myself, and yet here I was with a little envelope of cash that was mine. I walked into a secondhand store and bought a navy coat with deep pockets, the kind of coat that felt like armor, and when I looked in the mirror wearing it, I saw not a discarded woman, but someone sharp, someone real, someone who still had shape. It was not dramatic, this shift. No one shouted, no doors slammed, no declarations were made. Instead, it was the quiet accumulation of small acts, a rented room, a cafe job, a coat bought with money I had earned. And yet, in those small acts, there was a profound escalation, a slow but undeniable unraveling of the old life, the one in which I waited for their permission, their recognition, their crumbs of affection. Each day I stayed in Portland. Each morning I tied on my apron and poured another cup of coffee for a stranger. I stepped further away from the woman who had been laughed at on the wedding floor, and further into someone I had almost forgotten existed, someone who did not need an invitation to belong. The shift did not come all at once, not like thunder breaking a storm, but slowly, quietly, like a tide that at first you mistake for stillness, until you realize the shoreline has moved while you were not paying attention. And yet, there was one moment, one small gesture, that seemed to crystallize everything that had been changing within me, as though the life I had begun to build in Portland had been gathering its shape behind a veil and suddenly revealed itself to me with the gentlest unveiling. It was the day I received a letter, not from my daughter, not from anyone who shared my blood, but from the groom himself, the man who had stood beside her at the altar, who had kissed her hand and spoken his vows, who had witnessed my fall and, unlike her, had not laughed. The letter was handwritten in a slanted script that revealed both haste and care, and when I opened the envelope at the small desk in my rented room, I read words I had never expected. He apologized. He said he was ashamed of how the evening had unfolded, that he had seen me stumble, seen the pain on my face, and worse, had seen how no one rose to help, how the bride, my daughter, had looked away, how the room had carried on as though I were not part of the celebration, but merely a servant who had tripped. He wrote that I had looked beautiful in my blue dress, that he had noticed my quiet dignity, that he had felt the wrongness of my exclusion. He admitted he had done nothing in the moment, had been paralyzed by the politics of the day, but that silence had gnawed at him, and now, weeks later, he could no longer keep it unspoken. I sat there with the paper trembling in my hands, my eyes moving over his words again and again, because I needed to be certain they were real, that someone else had seen what I had lived, that it was not a figment of my wounded pride. For so long I had been told, implicitly and explicitly, that my perception was skewed, that I was too sensitive, too demanding, too dramatic. But here was validation written in ink by a man with no reason to flatter me, no stake in comforting me except that he had felt compelled to tell the truth. It was not love, it was not pity, it was recognition. And that is sometimes the most powerful gift a person can offer. To look at you and say, yes, what you experienced was real. Yes, it was wrong. Yes, you mattered in that moment, and you were treated as though you did not. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer of the nightstand, and for the rest of the evening, I walked around the room with a strange buoyancy, as though my feet no longer sank quite so heavily into the floorboards. The next morning, when I tied my apron at the cafe and poured coffee for the first wave of customers, I carried myself differently, not with arrogance, but with a steadiness, because I knew I had been seen, and that knowledge changes the posture of a body. It lifts the chin and steadies the hands, and I found that I was no longer just surviving, but participating in my own life. Over the following weeks, I noticed other small shifts. Joyce, who had once looked at me with suspicion, began to offer me small kindnesses, like a second cup of tea at night, or a share of the cookies she baked when she was restless. Heather, the cafe manager, began to trust me with opening duties, handing me the keys without ceremony, and I felt in that gesture a respect I had not felt from my own family in years. Even the regulars at the cafe began to greet me by name, one of them leaving crossword puzzles torn from the newspaper on the counter for me, another tipping me generously because, as he said, I was the only one who refilled his cup without being asked. These were not grand gestures, not milestones that anyone else would record. But for me, they were evidence of belonging, proof that I had re-entered the world not as a burden, but as a participant. Perhaps the most important shift was internal, the way I began to think about myself when I was alone. In the early days after the wedding, I could hardly look in the mirror without flinching, as though my reflection carried the echo of her laughter. But now, when I caught sight of myself buttoning the navy coat or brushing my hair, I did not see humiliation. I saw a woman who had endured, who had built something new from scraps, who had not surrendered to the role assigned to her by an ungrateful daughter. There was a solidity to me, like the worn oak of a table that has survived generations, not polished, not flawless, but enduring. And endurance itself had become a kind of beauty. One evening, after a long shift at the cafe, I walked into a second-hand bookstore and found myself wandering the aisles without purpose, my fingers grazing spines until they rested on a slim volume of poems. I do not know why I chose it, except that the cover was soft and the price was low. But when I took it home and read it under the glow of the desk lamp, I found lines that spoke of women who survive by remembering who they are, who rise not from applause but from silence. I underlined passages and wrote notes in the margins, something I had not done in years, and when I closed the book, I realized I was not merely passing time. I was feeding myself with words, reminding myself that I still had a mind worth tending, a spirit that was not finished. The midpoint of my story, though I did not name it then, was not just receiving that letter, but what it represented. The crossing from being erased to being seen, from silence to voice, from passivity to agency. It was as if someone had opened a window in a room I had long accepted as airless, and the sudden rush of breeze reminded me that there were other ways to live. From that point onward, I no longer thought of myself as someone abandoned. I thought of myself as someone who had chosen to keep moving, who had chosen to build. And once you make that shift in your mind, everything else begins to bend toward it. The peace I had begun to gather around myself, fragile and imperfect though it was, did not last unchallenged, because life has a way of testing even the smallest gains, and it was inevitable, I suppose, that the past would find me again, not directly at first, not in the form of my daughter's voice or her laughter, but in softer, more piercing echoes that arrived in unexpected packages, like the letter I discovered one evening, tucked into the small pile of mail Joyce had placed on the kitchen table, her cigarette dangling between two fingers as she muttered that something had come for me. The envelope was addressed in a handwriting that stopped my breath. It was my grandson's, the boy who had once sat with me in the garden, building a birdhouse, the only one of that younger generation who ever visited me without prompting, who listened to my stories without rolling his eyes, who once, when he was no older than 12, told me I was his favorite person because I didn't make him feel stupid. His name was Kieran, and seeing his script on the paper was like being touched by sunlight after weeks of gray. The letter itself was short, just a few lines, but every word carried weight. "Grandma, where are you? Dad and Mom are worried. They said you disappeared. I've been checking every day. I miss you. Please let me know you're okay." At the bottom, he had scrawled his phone number, a new one, as though he were offering me a lifeline across the distance. I read it twice, then a third time, folding and unfolding the paper until its creases softened, and though I did not pick up the phone that night, I felt something stir in me, a tenderness I had thought extinguished, proof that not every bond had been poisoned, that somewhere in the web of family that had discarded me, there was one thread still intact. But almost as soon as that warmth entered me, the cold returned, because only a week later, another letter arrived. This one thick and heavy, with the familiar angular handwriting of my daughter. No greeting, no tenderness, just 6 pages of accusations. She wrote that I had humiliated them, that by vanishing from the airport, I had created a scandal, that she had been forced to explain to her children and her in-laws why her mother had staged a disappearance. She insisted that I had chosen the worst possible moment, that I had always been dramatic, selfish, difficult, and that my absence had ruined their family vacation, turning what should have been a celebration into stress. There was not a single sentence acknowledging the 8 hours I had waited in that lounge, not one mention of the fact that they had walked away from me. Instead, she twisted the story so that I was the one who had abandoned them, painting herself as the victim of my cruelty. She ended by saying, "We are willing to talk, but only if you are ready to be reasonable." Reasonable. That was the word she chose, as though decades of cooking, babysitting, paying bills, and enduring slights had been unreasonable, as though asking for acknowledgement was hysteria. I folded the letter slowly and slid it back into the envelope, my hands steady, though inside me a storm gathered. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not crumble. Instead, I felt the quiet clarity of recognition, the undeniable knowledge that this was not an appeal for reconciliation, but an attempt at control, a performance of concern meant to re-establish the hierarchy in which I was always beneath, always dependent, always guilty. And though it stung, though it burned with the acid of betrayal, it also sharpened me. Because when you see manipulation clearly, it loses its power to disguise itself as love. In the days that followed, the pressure increased. One morning, as I was wiping down counters at the cafe, Heather approached me with an odd expression and handed me a folded newspaper someone had left behind. On the front page of the community section was a photograph of me, taken years ago at some family gathering, holding a pie dish and smiling without showing teeth. The headline read, "Missing Matriarch. Family speaks out on grandmother's disappearance." Beneath it were quotes from my daughter and her husband, Adam, insisting that they were deeply worried, that I was vulnerable, that my sudden vanishing was out of character. Lisa, my daughter-in-law, was quoted as saying, "She's not the type to do something like this. We fear something has happened." I laughed out loud when I read those words, the sound startling even me, sharp and bitter, because it was obscene. This theater of concern, this rewriting of reality, this public performance of grief and innocence by the very people who had left me sitting in a lounge like forgotten luggage. Joyce, reading over my shoulder, muttered that I should sue them for underestimating me, and Heather, though she said nothing, placed a hand on my arm in a gesture that felt like solidarity. But the article still cut deep, not because I believed their words, but because I knew how convincing they would appear to others, how easily the world accepts the image of an old woman as fragile, confused, incapable, a burden. That word, vulnerable, rang in my ears for days, a label they had affixed to me like a sticker on a package, a way of stripping me of agency, even as I was quietly rebuilding it. Not long after that, the intrusion became more direct. One afternoon, a man in a suit appeared outside the cafe, waiting until my shift ended before stepping inside and removing his sunglasses. He introduced himself as Derek Sorensen, a lawyer representing Adam and Lisa, and in a voice polished with professional courtesy, he explained that they were very concerned about my well-being and my assets. My assets. That word was the real reason he was standing there. He suggested it might be best for me to return, to allow the family to ensure I was in a safe environment, to discuss next steps. I folded my apron neatly on the counter, looked him directly in the eye, and told him, "Tell Adam and Lisa I'm not a pet they forgot to pick up. My well-being is excellent, and my assets are none of your business." Then I walked past him into the sunlight, my back straight, leaving him blinking in the brightness like a man who had expected compliance and received defiance instead. Each of these moments, the letter from my daughter, the newspaper article, the lawyer's visit, was a tightening of pressure, an escalation designed to push me back into the role they had assigned me. And yet, each one had the opposite effect, because the more they pressed, the clearer it became that I could not return, not without annihilating the fragile new life I had begun to build. I was tested again when Lisa herself appeared at the cafe one gray Thursday afternoon, standing stiffly by the pastry display, pretending to read the chalkboard menu. She looked out of place, polished and brittle in her tailored coat, and when she finally approached me, her voice was low, asking if we could talk privately. I led her to a booth in the back, and she began with excuses, claiming they had panicked at the airport, that they thought I was behind them, that the children were cranky. I raised an eyebrow and said, 8 hours, Lisa. 8 hours and not one phone call. She looked down at her manicured hands, and when she finally spoke again, her words were sharper, more revealing. I wasn't trying to replace you. I just didn't want your shadow in every room. That was the closest thing to honesty I had ever heard from her, and it struck me like cold water, because it confirmed what I had always felt, but never been told outright, that my existence was inconvenient, my presence unwelcome, my very being a threat to the version of family she wanted to curate. I stood, my voice calm, and said, "I'm not your shadow, Lisa. I'm my own person, and I finally remembered how to be one." Then I walked away, leaving her with her untouched coffee, and I felt lighter, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. That evening, I sat on Joyce's porch, wrapped in a blanket against the autumn air, and I realized that the escalation had not destroyed me. It had clarified me. They were coming at me with letters, with lawyers, with guilt and gaslighting, but each attempt only burned away another layer of illusion, leaving behind the solid truth. I was no longer theirs to diminish. This second escalation, then, was not just the family's attempt to reclaim me. It was the crucible in which I tested the strength of my new self, the stage on which I proved, perhaps for the first time in my life, that I could face their manipulations without bending, without apologizing for existing. And though I knew there would be more to face, though I knew the past would not let go easily, I also knew that I had crossed a line, that the tide had turned, and that whatever came next would not find me waiting silently in a lounge for someone else to decide my fate. The invitation came on thick cream paper with embossed lettering, elegant in its formality, though I knew before even opening it what it would be, because I had heard whispers through the thin thread of gossip that still reached me. Whispers carried by cousins and neighbors who had not been told the full story, but had pieced together enough to know that my daughter was expecting a child. The baby shower was set in a country club hall, the kind of place where chandeliers pretend at grandeur and tables are dressed to disguise their sameness, and the card bore my name in the same practiced script that had once written me accusations. the same hand that had left me behind at the airport. For a long while, I sat at my desk staring at the envelope, the letter from the groom still tucked safely in the drawer beside me, and I debated whether to burn it, to ignore it, to spare myself the humiliation of being paraded once again as the tolerated mother, present only because absence would be a scandal. But something in me resisted the idea of silence. I had remained silent too long already, swallowing indignities until they calcified in my chest. This time, I decided, I would go, but not to play their role. I would go with my own words, my own voice, and I would speak them where they could not be ignored. In the weeks before the event, I drafted a letter, not long, but deliberate, each sentence carved from the stone of my experience, not sharp with accusation, but steady with truth. I wrote of the fall, of the laughter, of the silence that followed, of the abandonment not only at the wedding, but for years before it. And I wrote of what I had found since, the quiet dignity of making my own living, the discovery that I did not vanish simply because they treated me as invisible. I wrote these things not to wound, but to mark the record, to place my truth alongside theirs so that history would not be written only by those who sought to erase me. And when I finished, I folded the pages carefully, placed them in an envelope, and slipped it into the pocket of my navy coat, the one with deep pockets that felt like armor. The day of the shower was bright but cold, a wind off the river carrying the scent of damp leaves and distant smoke, and I walked into the club hall with my head high, my steps measured, my heart beating with a rhythm I had not felt in years, not the rhythm of fear, but of resolve. Inside, the tables glittered with decorations. Pastel balloons floated like fragile promises, and everywhere there was chatter, laughter, the clinking of glasses. My daughter, radiant in a pale dress that skimmed her growing belly, stood surrounded by her friends, her cheeks flushed with the adoration of those who had never known her cruelty. She glanced at me only briefly when I entered, a flicker of surprise in her eyes quickly replaced by a smile polished for the crowd. They seated me at a table near the back, as always, as though distance itself could mute my presence. But I sat calmly, watching, waiting. Gifts were unwrapped with squeals of delight. Speeches were made about the joy of new life, and at last someone announced that the grandmother might want to say a few words. I could feel the shift in the room as heads turned toward me, some with curiosity, some with discomfort, some already preparing to dismiss whatever would come. My daughter looked at me with a smile that was both invitation and warning, the kind of smile that says, "Stay in your place." But I stood, slowly, carefully, feeling the weight of my years but not cowed by them, and when I began to speak, my voice carried across the hall with more strength than I expected, strong enough that the chatter hushed and the clinking of glasses ceased. I did not raise my voice. I did not tremble or cry. I simply spoke with the clarity of someone who has nothing left to lose. I said that I was proud to have lived long enough to see another generation come into this family, that life was a cycle of giving and receiving, of care passed down from one to another. And then, without anger, without bitterness, I said, I raised a daughter who has often mistaken cruelty for strength, who has learned to hide her shame by mocking her mother. But I have also seen, within this family, a man who knew better, who understood that dignity is not a performance, but an act of recognition. And I will not pretend otherwise, not here, not anywhere. The silence that followed was profound, heavy, thick with the discomfort of those who prefer their celebrations unmarred by truth. My daughter's face flushed crimson, her mouth opening as though to speak, but no words came, and in that pause I reached into my pocket, withdrew the envelope, and placed it on the table before the groom. His eyes met mine, wide with something I could not entirely read, perhaps gratitude, perhaps surprise, perhaps simply the shock of honesty in a room trained to avoid it. I did not wait for applause or acknowledgement. I did not stay to witness the ripple of whispers that would follow. I simply gathered my coat around me and walked toward the door, my steps steady, my spine unbent. Outside, the cold air met me like an embrace, and I realized that this was my culmination, not in the drama of confrontation, but in the act of choosing my own dignity over their acceptance. For the first time in decades, I had spoken my truth without apology, without softening it to protect their comfort. And though I knew I might never be invited to another gathering, though I knew my words would be twisted and retold as proof of my madness, I also knew that I had broken the silence that had bound me for so long. The rupture was irreversible, and I did not mourn it. I breathed deeply, the crisp air filling my lungs, and I felt lighter than I had in years. When I left the hall that afternoon and stepped into the air that smelled of damp earth and autumn leaves, I knew that something final had taken place, though it did not feel like the ending of a battle so much as the closing of a book whose last pages had long been written, and in that realization there was no grief, no despair, only a calm that spread through me like the steady warmth of tea after a long walk in the cold. I did not look back at the building, at the balloons pressed against glass, at the figures shifting uneasily behind the windows, because I no longer needed to measure myself against their expressions or anticipate their judgments. I walked down the gravel path slowly, feeling each stone beneath my shoes, and it struck me that I was walking not away from them, but toward myself, toward a place where my existence did not depend on whether or not they granted me recognition. In the days that followed, there were no phone calls, no olive branches disguised as reprimands, no apologies wrapped in conditions, and I understood that my absence would soon be explained away by them in whatever terms were convenient, that I would become a story told at dinners and holidays, a warning perhaps, or a source of ridicule, the narrative twisted into something that absolved them of shame. But I no longer felt the old desperation to correct the record, to defend myself against their distortions, because the letter now in the groom's possession existed as my testament, my version, and whether it was read in silence or torn to shreds, whether it was shared or hidden, did not matter as much as the fact that I had written it, that I had spoken, that I had placed my truth where it could no longer be denied by silence. That knowledge gave me a steadiness I had not felt in decades, a kind of invisible foundation beneath my feet. Back in my rented room in Joyce's house, life settled into a rhythm that was quieter, but also richer than anything I had known in the suffocating orbit of my family. I continued to work at the cafe, the faces of regular customers becoming as familiar to me as distant cousins once were. And there was comfort in the ordinariness of it, in the way small rituals gave shape to days. I read more in the evenings, sometimes aloud to Joyce, who would pretend to scoff, but always leaned closer to listen, and on weekends I walked to the river, tossing pebbles into the current one by one, not as prayers or regrets, but as small markers of time, each stone a reminder that I was still here, still moving, still shaping a life even in its late chapters. What surprised me most was how little I missed them once the noise had quieted. For years I had lived with the ache of wanting to be included, of longing for a phone call or an invitation. But when I stopped expecting those things, when I stopped framing myself as a mother waiting to be summoned, I discovered that the silence was not empty but spacious, filled with possibility rather than absence. I did not need their voices to confirm that I was alive. I could feel it in the strength of my own steps, in the clarity of my own thoughts, in the slow but steady return of laughter that came not from cruelty, but from small joys. A neighbor's cat curling on my lap, the taste of hot soup on a cold night, the satisfaction of finishing a crossword puzzle in ink. Sometimes I think of Kieran, my grandson, and I hope that one day he will find me, not because I need rescuing, but because I want him to know that I survived, that I did not vanish into the margins as others might have told him. Perhaps he will remember the birdhouse, the afternoons in the garden, and realize that I am still the same woman who saw him not as a child to be managed, but as a person to be known. And if he never comes, that too is all right, because I no longer hinge my existence on the recognition of others. My life is mine, and at 81, I have finally understood that this is enough. Now, when I walk by the ocean or sit by the river, I think of the woman I was at the wedding, lying on the floor while laughter echoed above me, and I want to reach back to her, to whisper that the humiliation she felt would not be the end, that she would rise again, not in the eyes of her daughter, perhaps not in the eyes of anyone in that glittering hall, but in her own eyes, which is the only gaze that truly matters. If there is one message I would pass on to any woman who has felt invisible in the presence of those she loved most, it is this: you do not need their hands to lift you. You do not need their voices to name you. You do not need their permission to exist. Stand up anyway. Dust off your knees. Walk forward even if no one follows. Someone saw you once. Someone will see you again. But most of all, you must see yourself, and once you do, no laughter can unmake you.